Masters Inside for letting me be here today. I'm only an undergrad student, but my research today, my presentation today, is based on my honors research that I started this year, which focuses on Miss Du's death in custody. In my research, I have canvassed the public archive to try and understand the conditions Miss Du died under and the possibility of justice through alternative and subversive means when institutional justice in an already compromised system appears inconceivable. So Miss Du was 22 years old when she died on the 4th of August in 2014, within 48 hours of her incarceration for the non-payment of fines. She died from advanced septicemia originating from a broken rib that her partner gave her in a violent altercation. In her first 2 days in custody, she visited the hospital twice, and her pain was attributed to behavioral issues by 2 different doctors, and then she was released back into custody. She died on that 3rd day. During her time in custody, she received little to no response from the police when she was sobbing, vomiting, and begging for help in her cell. The lack of compassion and care Ms. Du was afforded, and the abuse officers hurled at her, calling her a junkie, asking her to shut up, raises questions about the boundaries of humanity and implies that sovereign power goes beyond that of incarceration and violent neglect to the actual crafting of bodies into not quite lives to facilitate their elimination. Ms. Du's story, although her own, narrates a familiar story of Indigenous over-incarceration, domestic violence, and death in custody. Indigenous women are the fastest growing penal population in Australia, and as anti-colonial scholars and Indigenous scholars keep telling us, over-incarceration and family violence has to be situated within an historical framework informed by processes of colonial dispossession, genocide, assimilation, and forms of resistance to these processes. Scholars have also unraveled how all of these projects, as informed by a constructed Indigenous difference, created disastrous health and lifestyle issues, which is now conceived as a cultural difference as opposed to being state manufactured. Ms. Du's death originated from broken ribs done to her by a partner. When situating this violence within a history of colonial dispossession, the state is implicated. When Ms. Du in her teens incurs several arrests for public order offenses, the state is implicated. When Ms. Du is criminalized for poverty and incarcerated for the non-payment of fines at the age of 22, the state is implicated. When Ms. Du is discredited as a junkie, undeserving of adequate care, the state is implicated. And when she is exposed to death via violent neglect and dies within 48 hours of entering custody, the state remains implicated. So Ms. Du's death in custody implicates the state at every conceivable moment. However, the state carefully excludes itself from issues of over-incarceration, family violence, and death in custody by crafting these issues as issues of individual pathology. In Ms. Du's case, this framing led to the state officer's perception of her as a failed subject, unworthy of compassion and care. Debbie Kilroy and Kim Pate have revealed prisons as brutalizing environments, perpetuating women's experiences of powerlessness and violence, where women depend on prison officers to meet their every need. Ms. Du's death in custody illustrates the same. And because Ms. Du wasn't denied compassion and care in this environment, she was made vulnerable to death. So this renders the question, why was Ms. Du denied compassion and care? Judith Butler, an American philosopher, has developed the notion of precarious life. Butler provides that our bodies entail mortality and vulnerability by virtue of our bodies existing in the public sphere. And because they exist in the public sphere, our bodies are not really our own, as I always exist in relation to you. And although all bodies are precarious and vulnerable, this vulnerability must be apprehended to be able to come into play in an ethical encounter. It is not until a life is apprehended as precarious that it is protected. As such, the precariousness of my life means that my life is always in some way in your hands. And whether or not you apprehend my life as precarious depends on how I am framed. We can discern the police's inability to apprehend Ms. Du's life as a life that matters in Ms. Du's encounters with the state. Miss Du visited the hospital for the first time on the 2nd of August during her first night in custody. Upon this visit, her pain and illness was attributed to drug withdrawals and behavioral issues. This rationalized Miss Du's pain as a performance and not real. What followed in subsequent events illustrates that this framed Miss Du, that is in the sense of being falsely accused, as an abject subject undeserving of care. When Miss Du returned from her first hospital visit on the 2nd of August, her state deteriorated rapidly, and for the next 20 hours she was witnessed by several police officers and inmates in adjoining cells calling out for help, begging to be taken to the hospital, sobbing in agony and vomiting. The indifference to Miss Du's pain illustrates that her vulnerability was unrecognizable by the police by virtue of their perception of her as a lying, criminal, dysfunctional subject whose pain was not real but performed. Miss Du existed in relation to the officers, and their willingness to let her suffer underscores their inability to perceive her life as an endurable life. Miss Du encountered a lethal indifference, which by its very persistence became a dehumanizing instrument of degradation which culminated in violent treatment done to her on her last day in custody. On Miss Du's last day in custody, an officer entered her cell and attempted to yank her into a sitting position. Instead, she lost her grip, causing Miss Du to hit her head on the concrete floor. This officer did not ask Miss Du if she was okay or check her head for a wound, but merely made sure that there was no blood on the floor. This was the day Miss Du died in custody, so even though she was close to death, no concern was invoked. This demonstrates that Miss Du was made into an unreal body during her time in custody by virtue of her encounters crafting her as such. And by that token, the police failed to perceive Miss Du's life as a life that mattered. When the police brought Miss Du to the hospital for the last time, they handcuffed her, lifted her under her arms, and dragged her from a cell and put her in the back of the police van to be transported to the hospital. During the inquest, an observer made the remark that Miss Du was being carried like a dead kangaroo, and this statement has been echoed in the public archive. The characterization of the police treatment of Miss Du's body as similar to the treatment of a dead animal carcass refers to the total elimination of Miss Du's political status. The invocation of the carcass in describing the police treatment of Miss Du's body illustrates dehumanization made possible by incarceration and marks a state of total eviction from the category of human in their eyes. In the coronial inquest, Miss Du's death will be understood as a consequential failure of police or procedure. Her death will be recognized as unfortunate. It will be acknowledged as preventable, having resulted from the state not acting quite as it should. However, in Australia, where the Indigenous subject has to be disappeared to perfect sovereign rule, she has to be actively disappeared again and again through the different modes of governance enacted against Indigenous bodies to negate those lives again and again. Therefore, violence against Miss Du's body was not a failure of procedure or policy, was intended. In light of justice being inconceivable in this case, we should examine the possibility of justice through other means, like through releasing the CCTV footage and an activist group's projection of Miss Du's image across prominent Perth buildings. So, in terms of the CCTV footage and social media, preventable Indigenous deaths in custody has sparked a small activist movement online. In regards to Miss Du, the hashtags Justice for Miss Du, Release the CCTV, and Black Lives Matter have been perpetuated via Twitter. Miss Du's allies' Black Lives Matter movement has emerged as a powerful tool of resistance and political effect. Since March 2016, when the coroner ruled that the CCTV footage would not be released to the public, developments in Miss Du's case have occurred primarily because of social media and the family's pressure, as illustrated in Senator Rachel Stewart and Sue Lyons passing a motion in the Senate calling on the state government to respect the wishes of Miss Du's family and make the CCTV footage of her death available to the public. In wake of the four coroners airing Australia's shame, showing the perpetration of gross human rights violations against children in juvenile detention, as well as the mobilization of the Black Lives Matter movement, we have seen that footage galvanizes where words do not. Like any footage, the CCTV footage has the potential to be employed in different ways depending on mode of display and discursive framing. For Miss Du's family, it can be employed as a means of making visible the violence that is invisible, and the violence that is naturalized and scaled down in the coronial inquest, which always occurs, that makes possible the legal interpretation that always occurs on a field of pain and death. The initial refusal to release the footage and the continued reservation to release the footage manifests itself not only as another colonial assertion of power, but also the power to control the indigenous subject's framing in the public sphere. Although footage is not the end-all be-all, its mere circulation may break out misdue from an imprisonment within existing frames, and it would also necessarily frame the state as a perpetrator of violence and allow it to come into focus in new ways. Cameras capturing CCTV footage exist to serve the state's controlling means, with the state as the photographer and misdue's pain and death in the vestibule as a scene. Ethan Blue, a historian at the University of Western Australia, explained in a piece he published recently on misdue's death in custody that images of suffering and abjection captured by technologies made for the state's control can be appropriated from a means of control and used as an indictment of the colonial state itself. Along this insight, we may consider the relationship between the photographer, camera, and the scene. Here, the camera is an extension of the state, always in the field of vision, but not in the image. This is a lie because the state is there, the footage would not exist without it. It controls the frame, and therefore the scene, but includes itself. Hence, the coroner's refusal to release the images to the public until now and hereafter is in the interest of controlling the scene. This refusal masks itself as a cultural concern to conceal the state's reluctance to relinquish its control. Turning to the projections. So in the wake of frustration with the coronial inquiry, allies of Miss Dhu began projecting images of Miss Dhu and her grieving family on buildings in Perth to raise awareness of her death and the importance of her inquest. The anonymous group began their initiative in February 2016 when they would travel around Perth in the evenings and strategically single out prominent, symbolically resonant buildings and project giant images of Miss Dhu as well as her family at rallies, grieving in resistance. This project hints at the possibility of justice via alternative and subversive means run by an activist group rather than the state. Here, the projection's power function via their appropriation of the public space, their temporality, and the symbolic significance of the buildings they appear on. The projections appeared on the East Perth Watch House, the Major Crime Building, Royal Perth Hospital, and the Parliament House, all complicit in Miss Dhu's death. Aiming projections against powerful state institutions complicit in her death challenges their illusion of institutional transparency. And even though all of these institutions are producers of dominant narratives ordinarily internalized as truth by the general public, these projections act so as to layer those buildings with an alternative voice. Although these institutions are representative of democratic governance, public health, and criminal justice, the supreme authority and perceived benevolence of each serves to conceal their organized violence against bodies derealized and made disposable through the social crafting conducted by these institutions as mechanisms of power. By projecting images of Miss Dhu, whose death was caused by each institution's compounding violence against her body, our assumption of each institution's authoritative narrative is interrogated and undermined. As such, the projections engage with reimagining Miss Dhu in the public sphere. The projections also function beyond challenging the social crafting conducted by these institutions. Projecting images of Miss Dhu and her grieving family on these buildings unmasks the state violence against Indigenous people, often naturalized. The appearance of images of a young and vital Miss Dhu reveals her death as an unnatural aberration. Having these images accompanied by a grieving family illustrates that her life is grievable and not isolated, but part of a community. Although the state, as an administrator of death through the prison as its necropolitical tool, pushed Miss Dhu to the margins of society, exposed her to social death, and ultimately to physical death, her life was nevertheless lived, and by that same token, attended by grief when it came to its tragic conclusion. If what Butler proposes is true, that is, that grief can only attend a life that matters, by demonstrating the grievability of Miss Dhu's life, these projections also reassert Miss Dhu's life as a life that matters. The act of imposing a marginalized presence on a permanent, large-scale building can also be read as an appropriation of space from dominant state power, and by that token emerges a destabilizing and interrupting force, imposing itself temporarily on a permanent object. Projecting images of Miss Du's image in the foreground to an Indigenous flag challenges the primacy of white possessive sovereignty in Australia. At the same time, the projections function to merely appropriate the space, which is different from the domination and destruction of space, which may be equated to the white settlers' transformation of Indigenous land. Therefore, in the act of projecting images of Miss Du and Indigenous sovereignty on these buildings, this Indigenous presence avoids doing the same violence as that of continued colonialism of the white settler. Because this act of protesting reveals sovereignty's violence while refusing to do the same violence, the projection becomes a symbolic violence that truly disturbs. As projections require darkness to appear, the projections of Miss Du appeared on the buildings during nighttime. By projecting images in a sleeping building, dreaming of itself, reconstituting itself, its unconscious is revealed and its mythic origins unmasked. Namely, the myth that the relationship between the state and Indigenous people is one between savior and people that need saving, the myth that perpetuates a self-justifying narrative of a set of liberal, universally beneficial institutions that are as good for Black Australia as they are for white Australia.
Mm-hmm.